The greatest threats to democracy don't always come from outside its borders. Through decades of observing totalitarian movements, I've witnessed how democratic societies can unknowingly nurture the very forces that destroy them. This isn't about external invasion or military conquest, it's about democracy's internal vulnerabilities, the way free societies can gradually surrender their freedoms through the choices of their own citizens. What makes this particularly dangerous is that it happens through democratic processes themselves. Citizens vote for demagogues, embrace simplistic solutions to complex problems, and willingly trade freedom for the promise of security or prosperity. The irony is profound. Democracy's greatest strength, the sovereignty of the people, can become its fatal weakness when that sovereignty is exercised without wisdom, restraint, or understanding of democratic principles. Today, as American democracy faces its own internal pressures, understanding these self-destructive tendencies isn't just academic, it's essential for democratic survival. Chapter 1: The Democratic Paradox: How Freedom Enables Its Own Destruction. Democracy contains within itself a fundamental paradox that I've observed repeatedly. The very freedoms that define democratic life can be used to destroy democracy itself. This isn't theoretical, it's a pattern I witnessed firsthand during the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the rise of totalitarian movements across Europe. Democratic institutions, designed to protect liberty, can be captured by those who despise liberty. Democratic processes can elevate leaders who openly reject democratic values. The mechanism is deceptively simple. Democratic societies guarantee freedom of speech, assembly, and organization. These freedoms allow anti-democratic movements to organize, recruit, and spread their message. They can use democratic platforms to attack democracy itself, exploiting the very tolerance that democracy requires. When faced with such movements, democratic societies find themselves in an impossible position: suppress them and betray democratic principles, or allow them to continue and risk democratic destruction. This paradox becomes particularly acute during times of crisis. Economic hardship, social upheaval, or national humiliation create conditions where citizens become receptive to authoritarian promises. Democratic governments, constrained by constitutional limits and procedural requirements, often appear weak and ineffective compared to authoritarian alternatives that promise quick, decisive action. The democratic requirement for debate, compromise, and gradual reform seems inadequate when citizens demand immediate solutions. The American experience illustrates this tension perfectly. The Constitution's framers understood this danger, which is why they created a republic rather than a pure democracy, a system of checks and balances designed to prevent majority tyranny. Yet even these safeguards can be undermined when democratic culture itself erodes, when citizens lose faith in democratic processes and institutions. What makes this particularly insidious is that the erosion often happens gradually, through seemingly legitimate democratic means. Elected leaders slowly concentrate power, undermine independent institutions, and polarize society, all while maintaining the forms of democracy. Citizens, focused on immediate concerns, may not recognize the long-term threat until it's too late. Chapter 2: The Seduction of Simplicity: Why Complexity Terrifies Democratic Citizens. Democracy demands something profoundly difficult from its citizens: the ability to live with uncertainty, complexity, and incomplete solutions. This requirement goes against basic human psychology, which craves certainty, simple explanations, and clear enemies to blame for problems. Throughout my years of political observation, I've seen how this tension between democratic complexity and human simplicity creates opportunities for demagogues and ideologues. Democratic governance is inherently messy. It requires compromise between competing interests, balancing multiple valid concerns, and accepting that most political problems lack perfect solutions. Citizens must evaluate complex policy proposals, understand trade-offs, and tolerate the slow pace of democratic deliberation. They must accept that their preferred policies might not be adopted, that their representatives might disappoint them, and that political progress often comes in frustrating increments. This complexity exhausts citizens and creates what I call democratic fatigue, a weariness with the constant demands of democratic citizenship. When faced with economic uncertainty, social change, or international threats, the appeal of simple solutions becomes overwhelming. Demagogues understand this psychology perfectly. They offer clear enemies to blame, simple policies to solve complex problems, and the promise to cut through democratic inefficiency with decisive action. The seduction works because it contains a grain of truth. Democratic processes can be frustratingly slow. Special interests do sometimes capture democratic institutions. Compromise does sometimes produce suboptimal policies. But recognizing these legitimate frustrations with democracy doesn't mean abandoning democracy. It means improving democratic practice while preserving democratic principles. Consider how economic anxiety makes citizens receptive to protectionist appeals that ignore economic complexity. Or how concerns about social change drive support for policies that promise to restore an imagined past. These responses are understandable human reactions to uncertainty, but they become dangerous when they override careful analysis of causes and consequences. The challenge for democratic societies is helping citizens develop what I call democratic maturity, the capacity to tolerate uncertainty, appreciate complexity, and resist the seduction of simple solutions. This requires education, but not just technical knowledge. It requires cultivating intellectual virtues, patience with democratic processes, skepticism toward easy answers, and understanding that freedom requires accepting responsibility for collective decisions. Chapter 3: The Illusion of Popular Will, When Democracy Becomes Mob Rule. One of democracy's most dangerous illusions is the belief that the people speak with a unified voice that political leaders must simply discover and implement. This romantic notion of popular sovereignty ignores the reality that democratic societies contain multiple, often conflicting majorities on different issues. When political leaders claim to represent the real will of the people, while dismissing opposition as illegitimate, democracy begins its transformation into something far more dangerous. I've observed this pattern repeatedly. Demagogues who claim exclusive connection to popular will while portraying democratic institutions as obstacles to that will. They argue that constitutional constraints, judicial review, and legislative procedures are artificial barriers preventing the people's true desires from being realized. This narrative is seductive because it contains an element of truth. Democratic institutions do sometimes frustrate majority preferences. But this frustration serves a crucial purpose: protecting minority rights and ensuring that momentary passions don't override fundamental principles. The transformation from democracy to mob rule often begins with plebiscitary appeals, direct appeals to the people that bypass traditional democratic institutions. These appeals seem more democratic than traditional representative government, but they're actually profoundly anti-democratic. They reduce complex political questions to simple yes or no choices, eliminate the space for deliberation and compromise, and create artificial unanimity where genuine diversity exists. Consider how this dynamic plays out in American politics. Politicians claim mandates based on electoral victories, even when those victories represent narrow pluralities rather than overwhelming consensus. They dismiss opposition as obstruction rather than legitimate democratic participation. They appeal directly to supporters through mass media, bypassing the traditional mediating institutions that encourage moderation and compromise. This dynamic is particularly dangerous when combined with intense polarization. When citizens see political opponents not as fellow Democrats with different views but as enemies of the people, democratic competition becomes existential warfare. The minority becomes illegitimate, compromise becomes betrayal, and democratic norms become obstacles to righteous victory. The solution isn't to ignore popular preferences or dismiss democratic accountability. It's to maintain what constitutional theorists call democratic constitutionalism, systems that respond to popular will while protecting democratic principles from popular excess. This requires institutions that channel democratic energy while preventing democratic self-destruction, leaders who educate rather than simply follow public opinion, and citizens who understand that true democracy requires protecting the rights of those who disagree with them. Chapter 4: The Bureaucratic Temptation, When Efficiency Becomes the Enemy of Freedom. Modern democracy faces a subtler but equally dangerous threat: the gradual transfer of power from elected representatives to unelected administrative bureaucracies. This shift happens not through dramatic coups but through the quiet accumulation of regulatory authority, administrative discretion, and technocratic decision-making. Citizens, frustrated with legislative gridlock and political incompetence, often welcome this technocratic efficiency, not realizing they're trading democratic accountability for administrative convenience. The appeal of bureaucratic governance is understandable. Professional administrators possess technical expertise that elected officials often lack. They can implement policies consistently across time and geography, insulated from political pressures and electoral cycles. They promise efficient, rational governance based on expertise rather than politics. In an age of complex social and economic challenges, this technocratic approach seems obviously superior to messy democratic deliberation. But this efficiency comes at a profound cost: the erosion of democratic accountability. When crucial decisions are made by administrators rather than elected officials, citizens lose meaningful influence over policies that affect their lives. Administrative agencies develop their own institutional interests, which may diverge from public interests. Professional expertise, however valuable, cannot substitute for democratic legitimacy when it comes to fundamental choices about how society should be organized. I've witnessed how this dynamic unfolds across different democratic societies. Initially, administrative expansion appears benign, technical decisions delegated to technical experts. But gradually, the boundary between technical and political decisions becomes blurred. Administrators begin making choices that reflect particular values and priorities, justified as neutral implementation of expert knowledge. Citizens find themselves subject to rules they never voted for, enforced by officials they never elected. The American administrative state illustrates both the benefits and dangers of this development. Federal agencies possess genuine expertise in complex areas like environmental protection, financial regulation, and public health. But they also exercise enormous discretionary power with limited democratic oversight. Citizens may find their businesses regulated by rules they didn't know existed, enforced by officials who answer to other officials rather than to voters. This bureaucratic insulation from democratic pressure isn't necessarily intentional. It often results from well-meaning attempts to protect important policies from political interference. But the cumulative effect is the creation of a parallel governing system that operates according to technocratic rather than democratic principles. Citizens become clients rather than sovereigns, receiving services rather than exercising power. The challenge is maintaining administrative competence while preserving democratic accountability. This requires institutional arrangements that combine expertise with responsiveness, efficiency with legitimacy. Most importantly, it requires citizens who understand that convenience and efficiency, however attractive, cannot justify abandoning democratic control over fundamental political decisions. Chapter 5: The Polarization Trap: How Democratic Competition Destroys Democratic Cooperation. Healthy democratic competition requires a paradox. Political parties must compete vigorously for power while maintaining sufficient trust and shared commitment to democratic norms that they can cooperate when necessary. When this balance collapses, when competition becomes total warfare, democracy begins consuming itself from within. This is perhaps the most immediate threat facing American democracy today, and understanding its dynamics is crucial for democratic survival. Polarization doesn't begin as an anti-democratic force. Indeed, meaningful political competition requires some degree of disagreement between parties or factions. The problem arises when these disagreements become total, when opposing parties view each other not as legitimate competitors but as existential threats. When this happens, normal democratic restraints, the informal norms that make democratic competition possible, begin breaking down. The transformation follows a predictable pattern. Initially, parties disagree about policies while sharing basic commitments to democratic procedures. Gradually, these policy disagreements become identity conflicts, where party membership becomes a core aspect of personal identity rather than simply a political preference. Citizens begin selecting information sources that confirm their existing beliefs, living in increasingly separate social and media environments that reinforce partisan identities. As polarization intensifies, the stakes of political competition appear to rise dramatically. Each election becomes a battle for the soul of the nation rather than a choice between different approaches to governance. Compromise becomes not just politically difficult but morally suspect. Why compromise with evil? Opposition victories become illegitimate by definition since the other side represents everything your side opposes. This dynamic creates what I call the polarization trap. Each side's extreme actions justify the other side's extreme responses, creating an escalating cycle of norm-breaking and institutional warfare. Constitutional hardball becomes standard practice. Previously unthinkable behaviors, refusing to consider Supreme Court nominees, threatening government shutdowns over routine matters, questioning election legitimacy, become routine partisan tactics. The media environment amplifies these tendencies by rewarding the most polarizing voices with attention and ratings. Social media algorithms prioritize content that generates strong emotional responses, which tend to be the most extreme and divisive messages. Citizens receive constant reinforcement for their most partisan instincts while being shielded from information that might moderate their views. Breaking free from the polarization trap requires conscious effort from both leaders and citizens. Leaders must resist the short-term incentives that reward extreme rhetoric and norm-breaking behavior. Citizens must seek out diverse information sources and resist the psychological comfort of partisan echo chambers. Most importantly, both must remember that their political opponents are fellow citizens rather than enemies of democracy itself. Chapter 6: The Crisis of Institutional Legitimacy, When Citizens Stop Believing. Democracy depends not just on formal institutions but on citizen belief in the legitimacy of those institutions. When that belief erodes, when citizens lose faith in elections, courts, legislatures, and bureaucracies, democracy enters a crisis that formal procedures alone cannot resolve. This crisis of legitimacy represents perhaps the deepest threat to democratic societies, because it undermines the voluntary compliance that makes democratic governance possible. Institutional legitimacy rests on a complex foundation. Citizens must believe that institutions operate fairly, that they respond to democratic input, and that they serve public rather than private interests. They must trust that electoral outcomes reflect genuine citizen preferences, that courts apply law rather than politics, that legislatures represent constituencies rather than special interests. When these beliefs collapse, institutions lose their capacity to govern effectively. The erosion typically begins with specific grievances, particular decisions or policies that anger citizens. But it metastasizes when these specific complaints become generalized distrust of institutional integrity. Citizens begin assuming that unfavorable outcomes result from institutional corruption rather than legitimate disagreement. They lose the capacity to distinguish between institutions working imperfectly and institutions not working at all. Contemporary American politics illustrates this dynamic clearly. Survey data shows declining trust in virtually all major institutions: Congress, the presidency, federal courts, election administration, law enforcement, and the media. Citizens increasingly view institutions through partisan lenses, supporting them when they produce favorable outcomes and questioning their legitimacy when they don't. This conditional loyalty undermines the bipartisan consensus that institutional legitimacy requires. The digital revolution has accelerated this crisis by making it easier for citizens to find evidence supporting their existing suspicions about institutional corruption. Social media amplifies conspiracy theories and alternative narratives that explain unfavorable outcomes as results of institutional manipulation rather than democratic processes. Citizens can construct entire worldviews based on information that confirms their distrust of established institutions. This crisis creates a vicious cycle. As institutions lose legitimacy, they become less effective at governing, which provides new evidence for citizen distrust. Political entrepreneurs exploit this distrust for partisan advantage, further undermining institutional credibility. Citizens retreat into partisan information environments that reinforce their suspicions about institutions controlled by the opposing party. Rebuilding institutional legitimacy requires both institutional reform and cultural change. Institutions must become more transparent, responsive, and accountable to public concerns. But citizens must also recover the capacity to distinguish between institutional imperfection and institutional illegitimacy. They must remember that democratic institutions reflect the broader society. They will be imperfect because democratic societies are imperfect, but that doesn't make them illegitimate or replaceable with non-democratic alternatives. Chapter 7: The Path Forward: Cultivating Democratic Resilience. Understanding democracy's vulnerabilities is only valuable if it leads to strengthening democratic resilience. This requires both institutional reforms and cultural changes, improvements in how democratic systems function and in how democratic citizens think and behave. The goal isn't to eliminate democracy's internal tensions but to manage them in ways that preserve democratic values while addressing legitimate citizen concerns. Institutional resilience begins with constitutional design that anticipates democracy's self-destructive tendencies. The American founders understood this, which is why they created a system of separated powers, federalism, and individual rights that constrain majoritarian excess. But constitutional structures alone are insufficient. They must be supported by democratic culture that values constitutional principles even when they produce inconvenient outcomes. This requires what I call constitutional patriotism, loyalty to democratic procedures and principles rather than to particular outcomes or leaders. Citizens must understand that democratic institutions sometimes frustrate their preferences precisely because they protect democracy from its own excesses. They must value the system that allows peaceful disagreement more than any particular resolution of that disagreement. Educational institutions play a crucial role in cultivating this constitutional patriotism. Citizens need not just technical knowledge about how government works but deeper understanding of why democratic principles matter. They need to appreciate the historical alternatives to democracy, understand the fragility of democratic achievements, and recognize their own responsibility for democratic preservation. Media literacy becomes essential in an information environment that rewards sensationalism and polarization. Citizens must learn to seek out diverse information sources, question their own confirmation biases, and distinguish between legitimate criticism of democratic institutions and anti-democratic propaganda. They must resist the psychological comfort of partisan echo chambers in favor of the intellectual challenge of engaging with different perspectives. Political leadership matters enormously in this process. Democratic politicians must resist the short-term incentives that reward norm-breaking and institutional destruction. They must educate citizens about democratic complexity rather than offering simplistic solutions to complex problems. They must model the democratic virtues they expect from citizens: tolerance for disagreement, respect for opposition, and commitment to constitutional procedures. Perhaps most importantly, citizens must recover a sense of agency and responsibility for democratic outcomes. Democracy's greatest strength, and its greatest vulnerability, is that it depends on citizen participation. When citizens become passive consumers of political entertainment rather than active participants in democratic deliberation, democracy loses its vitality and becomes vulnerable to demagogic manipulation. The path forward requires acknowledging democracy's imperfections while defending democratic principles, improving democratic practice while preserving democratic values, and cultivating democratic citizenship while respecting individual freedom. It's a challenging balance, but it's the only path that leads to democratic survival and renewal. Conclusion. Democracy's greatest enemy isn't external conquest but internal decay, the gradual erosion of democratic culture, institutions, and practices by democracy's own citizens. This threat is particularly dangerous because it appears through democratic processes themselves, making it difficult to combat without betraying democratic principles. Yet understanding these self-destructive tendencies offers hope for strengthening democratic resilience. The solution lies not in abandoning democracy's complexities but in cultivating citizens capable of navigating them wisely. This requires institutional reforms that address legitimate grievances while preserving democratic safeguards, educational efforts that prepare citizens for democratic responsibilities, and political leadership that models democratic virtues rather than exploiting democratic weaknesses. Democracy will always face internal tensions between freedom and order, majority rule and minority rights, efficiency and accountability. But these tensions become destructive only when citizens lose the capacity to manage them democratically. The choice facing democratic societies isn't between perfect democracy and its alternatives, it's between imperfect democracy and the far worse alternatives that arise when democratic societies destroy themselves from within.